One day, an Israeli woman goes to her local rabbi, and she says to her local rabbi, I have a dilemma. I need your wisdom. And she explains the story that when I was a younger woman, I was not religious. And once I had a relationship with a man, not married, and I got pregnant. And I did not want to have the baby, so I had an abortion. After that experience, I decided to take stock of my life. And I decided to change my life. And I decided to do teshuvah, repentance. I wanted to be a berikhah chadasha, a new person. I wanted to commit myself to learn Torah and to do mitzvot and to have a different future than I had a past. And so I left the community I've been living in. I left the town that I've been living in. I moved to an entirely new place, a new community. I joined an observant community, and there I found a wonderful man who's a yeshiva student. We fell in love, and we got married. I did not tell him about my past. And then I got pregnant and just recently had a baby boy. And now my husband wants to have a pidyon haben ceremony. Pause, footnote. A pidyon haben, redemption of the firstborn, is a birth ceremony that is had under certain circumstances on day 31 of this baby boy's life. But because of her abortion, this woman was not eligible to have this ceremony. This baby, this father, this woman, this family could not have the ceremony. That's just a premise of this whole case. And as part of that ceremony, the father who redeems his firstborn would make a blessing, berakhah Adonai Eloheinu, etc., etc. And because the ceremony should not have been had, that blessing should not have been said. And that blessing that he would say, if he would have this ceremony that he shouldn't have had, is called the berakhah levatala, a blessing that is said in vain. And in that kind of observant world, that's a big deal. Back to our narrative. So she says, Rabbi, I've never told my husband, and he wants to have this ceremony, and I don't know what to do. If I don't tell him about my past, we'll have this ceremony, and then my husband will be offering a berakhah levatala, a blessing that he should not have offered. And it's because I didn't tell him. On the other hand, if I tell him about my past, he won't do the berakhah levatala, but I'm not sure that our marriage could survive it. Rabbi, what should we do? What should I do? Should I tell my husband? And the rabbi, this local rabbi, says, that's above my pay grade. You need to bring in the top authority, and the top authority is the chief Sephardi rabbi of Israel, a man named Ovadia Yosef. So, Israel, as you know, just marked the 77th birthday, and it's fair to say that in the 77 years of Israel's existence, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is just one of the largest, most important figures in the history of the state. When he died in 2013, 800,000 people attended his service. That's more than fit in the sanctuary here. And in fact, Ovadia Yosef's funeral is the single largest funeral in the history of the state of Israel. And he was known for many things, which made him a good repository for this shaila, for this question. First of all, he knew the sources cold. Second of all, he had a reputation for just being a mensch and an exemplar of Torah. He was known as being very compassionate. After the Yom Kippur War, there were 1,000 Israeli women whose husbands had fought in the Yom Kippur War and did not come home, and they were missing. They were suspected fallen in battle, but it wasn't confirmed. And one read of Jewish law was they would have never been able to remarry lest this husband come back. And Ovadia Yosef spent hours on all 1,000 cases and liberated them so that they could rebuild their life and get married again. He was very inclusive. When Israel started receiving immigrants from Ethiopia, Ethiopian Jews, and some questions were raised, are Ethiopian Jews Jews? Ovadia Yosef, who had unimpeachable street cred, nobody would mess with Ovadia Yosef. He said they are absolutely Jewish. Ethiopian Jews are as Jewish as you or me. And so he was the father of the normalization of Ethiopian Jewry. And he was very practical and very political and had a lot of practical savvy. He's the father of Sephardi political power in Israel. He founded the Shas power, which has done a lot of good for Sephardi Jews and a more complicated legacy for Israel as a whole. So, Ovadia Yosef, this wise, compassionate, inclusive, savvy person, gets this question from the local rabbi. And his answer is clear and crisp and convicted. He says, this woman should not tell her husband, and they should have this ceremony, even if it's going to be a berakhah levatala. And then he rules that an imperfect peace is better than no peace, and a marriage, even with this lack of transparency, under these circumstances, is better than a divorce. Now, why do I tell you this tangled, messy, complicated story? It's such a happy Shabbos. We got a bar mitzvah, and we got an ofrah, and we've got so much beautiful energy. Why this tangled story? After all, most of us are not followers of Ovadia Yosef. And most of us don't really resonate with the ritual issue, the infraction issue of a berakhah levatala. And many of us may be uncomfortable with the ruling and the answer that it's better to have a marriage perpetuated by a lack of transparency than not to have the marriage. We're uncomfortable with that. So my question is, does this case connect with anyone in this sanctuary today? And the answer is yes. This case connects with everybody in this sanctuary today in the following way. It focuses on 3 words that all of us have said throughout our lives. When we look at something that is in our life, and it's not ideal, and it's a problem, and we don't really have a solution for the problem, and we say, it just is. I wouldn't have picked it off the menu, but it just is. I wouldn't have picked it off the menu, but there's no menu and you don't get to pick, and it just is. Everything about this story is, it just is. Her past, it just is. The fact that she didn't tell her husband, it just is. And the fact that there are 3 delicate lives that are at stake here, the mother and the father and the baby and the home they share together or they don't share together, it just is. When you look at your life, what is it that just is? We all have our own version of it. An aging parent, it just is. A struggling child, it just is. Cognitive decline, it just is. An aging body that can't do what it used to do, it just is. A broken relationship, it just is. Professional failure and financial distress, it just is. And that's just our personal lives. What about what's happening in our country that we wish were otherwise? It just is. What about, speaking of Israel at 77, what is happening in Israel that we wish were otherwise? It just is. What about what's happening in this hot mess of our world that we wish were otherwise. It just is. This case is about what do we do when it just is. And Ovadia Yosef's answer is so poignant and so brilliant. There's a reason he's Ovadia Yosef, and there's a reason that he had the single biggest funeral in the history of the state of Israel. Here's his answer. When it just is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When it just is, deepen it, nurture it, strengthen it. When it just is, we cannot make it perfect, but we can make it better. When it just is, make it better. And his message to this young woman is, make it better. Build an ever-loving marriage and create an ever-loving home. Now, I'll tell you why I was just so taken with this teshuvah and why it landed for me with a special resonance this week. This week I lost somebody we love, somebody I love very, very dearly, Joan Mayo. Joan worked at Temple Emmanuel for about 30 years. I worked with her every day for 28 years. And since both of my mothers are gone, I literally loved Joan like my mother. And I related to her like she was my mother, but I was in no way unique because everybody who worked here treated Joan and loved her like a mother. And yet, there was something about Joan's life that was profound and important and revealed every single day that I never saw in life. I never noticed it in life, even though I saw her literally every day, and even though I loved her, I never saw this in life. I only saw it when we buried her on Monday afternoon. When we buried her on Monday afternoon, we laid her to rest near her beloved husband, Sid Mayo. And I noticed on the matzeva, on the tombstone, his date, which is that Sid died in 2010. And then I did the quick math. That meant that Joan had been a widow for 15 years. And then her sons had shared that Sid had had Alzheimer's for 5 years. 5 years where she lost him before she lost him. 5 years of 36-hour caregiving days, which meant that it had been more than 20 years since Joan had had a healthy husband. And you would have expected that it would have been really hard and sad to roll out of bed in the morning. And yet, when I was with Joan, when we were with Joan, there was never hard and never sad. And what I picked up only at the graveside was the heroism of living every day with hope, daily heroism of daily hope in circumstances that are not necessarily hopeful. Now, why is it that I never noticed how hard and sad? Because Joan was always upbeat and was always resilient. And it wasn't an act, it was who she was. Resilience was not a facade, resilience was her soul. She was always bubby, going to visit her grandchildren. She was always dressed in colorful, hip clothing with jewelry. She was always having lunch dates and dinner dates. When she turned 80 and we wanted to do something for her, she wanted to go on March of the Living. In her 80s, she went to Israel to study at Hartman. Her resting face was a radiant smile. Her resting face was joy and blessing, even in the midst of the hardest of times. And Joan taught me this signal truth. The facts of our life, whatever the facts of our life are important, but our attitude about those facts is even more important. The facts of our life are important, but the energy we bring to those facts is even more important. That's why she was able to find joy and blessing, and that is why Ovadia Yosef ruled that this couple should build a home of love. When it just is, make it better. Shabbat Shalom.